Chapter 5, Part 2 of The Uttermost Farthing. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Marianne. The Uttermost Farthing by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 5, By-Products of Industry. Part 2. Once inside, I made my simple preparations rapidly. Placing the concussor in a tall cylindrical basket close to the cellar door, I opened the latter and hitched the rope in a position where I could grasp it easily. Then I took from the cupboard the tin of cart grease, and, with a large knife, spread a thick layer of the grease on the upper 4 steps of the cellar stairs. While thus engaged, I turned over my plans quickly but with considerable misgivings. The odds were greater than I ought to have taken, for, as to the intentions of these men, I could have no reasonable doubt. Bamber was known to me, and he would not run the risk of my giving information. The amiable intention of these gentry was to do me in, as they would have expressed it, and the vital question for me was, how did they mean to do it? Firearms they would probably avoid on account of the noise, but if they all came at me at once with knives my chance would be infinitesimal. It comes back to me now rather oddly that I weighed these probabilities quite impersonally, as though I were a mere spectator. As such was virtually the case. The fact is that, although I had long since abandoned the idea of suicide, I remained alive as a matter of principle and not by personal desire. My objection to being killed was merely the abstract objection to the killing of any worthy member of society by these human vermin. But if any such person must needs be killed, I was quite indifferent as to whether the subject of the action were myself or some other. I had no personal interest in the matter. Hence, when I unbolted the door and beckoned the 3 men into the room, though doubtful of the issue, I had no feeling of nervousness. The advantage that my impassiveness gave me over these 3 rascals was very evident when they slouched in, for they were all trembling and twitching with nervous excitement. And no wonder. To a man who values his life above everything on earth, it is a serious matter to walk into the very shadow of the gallows. As soon as they were inside, one of them, who looked like a Polish Jew, bolted the door, and then they gathered round me like a pack of hyenas. I backed unostentatiously into the corner by the cellar door, talking volubly to the 3 men by turn as I went, and the Jew edged along the wall to get behind me. I realized that he was the one whom I had to watch, and I watched him, not looking at him, but keeping him on the periphery of my field of vision, for, as it is well known, the peripheral area of the retina, although insensitive to impressions of form, is highly sensitive to impressions of movement. My remarks on the danger to respectable persons of meddling with stolen property gave Mr. Bamber his cue. "Stolen property!" he roared. "'Oo said anything about stolen property? What do yer mean, yer bloomin' scalp scraper?" And he advanced threateningly, with his chin stuck forward, and a most formidable scowl. In the next few moments I reaped the reward of my strenuous practice at the gymnasium of the art of jiu-jitsu and the French style of boxing. Bamber's advance was the signal. I had seen the Jew's hand steal under his coat-skirt. He now made a quick movement, and so did I. Whisking round, in an instant I had his wrist in that kind of grip that dislocates the elbow joint, and, as I turned, I planted my foot heavily on Spotty Bamber's chest. The swift movement took them all by surprise. The Jew screamed and then dropped his knife, staggering heavily against the cellar door, which swung back on its well-oiled hinges. Bamber flew backwards like a football, and, as he cannoned against the 3rd man, the 2 crashed together to the floor. I thrust the Jew through the open doorway, released his wrist, and then followed a slithering sound from the cellar steps, ending in a soft thump. The position was marvellously changed in those few moments. The Jew, I took it, was eliminated, and the odds thus brought back down to a reasonable figure. As to the other 2, though they scrambled to their feet quickly enough, they kept their distance, Bamber, in particular, having some little difficulty with his breath. I picked up the concussor and faced them. If I had been quick, I could have dispatched them both without difficulty, but I did not. Once more I was aware of that singular state of consciousness to which I have elsewhere alluded as possessing me in the presence of violent criminals, a vivid pleasure in the mere act of physical contest, perfectly incomprehensible to me in my normal state of mind. This strange joy now sent the blood surging through my brain until my ears hummed, and yet I kept my judgment, calmly attentive and even wary. Thus, when the 3rd ruffian rushed at me with a large sheathed knife, I knocked his hand aside quite neatly with the concussor, and drove him out of range with a heavy blow of my left fist. But at this moment I observed Bamber frantically lugging something from his hip pocket, something that was certainly not a knife. It was time for a change of tactics. Before the third rascal could close with me again, I darted at the open doorway, grasping the rope, and in an instant had swung myself clear of the steps down into the darkness of the cellar. In swinging I had turned half round, and, as I alighted, I saw my aggressor, knife in hand, come through the doorway in pursuit. He had more courage than Spotty, but less discretion. In the haste of his pursuit he actually sprang over the sill onto the slippery top step, and the next moment was bumping down the stairs like an overturned sack of potatoes. As he picked himself up, half stunned, from the prostrate Jew, on whom he had fallen, I regretfully felled him with the concussor. It was a dull finish to the affair, but there was Bamber's revolver to be reckoned with. To do Mr. Bamber justice, he was not rash. In fact, he was so unobtrusive that I began to fear that he had made off, and, it being obviously unsafe to go up and ascertain, I proceeded to make a few encouraging demonstrations. "Oh," I shouted, "let me go! Let go my hands or I'll call for the police!" This appeal had the desired effect. The dimly lighted doorway framed the figure of Spotty Bamber, with revolver poised, peering cautiously into the darkness. I renewed my protests and, retiring to the darkest corner, shuffled noisily about the brick floor. "'Ave yer got him, Alf?" inquired the discreet Bamber, leaning forward and stepping over the sill. I continued to dance heavily in my corner, and to utter breathless snorts and exclamations such as, "Let go, I tell you!" "Aha, would you?" and so forth. Bamber took another step forward, craned his neck, and called out, "Shove him over this way, Alf, so as I can—" He did not finish the sentence. Watching him, I saw his feet suddenly fly from under him, the revolver clatter on the cellar floor, and Spotty, himself having slipped halfway down the steps, fell over the edge onto the hard brick pavement. As he picked himself up, breathing heavily, I dropped the concussor into the big pocket of my apron and pounced on him. He uttered a yell of terror and began to struggle like a maniac to free himself from my grip, while I edged him away from the dangerous vicinity of the revolver. At first he was disposed to show a good deal of fight, and, as we gyrated round the cellar, tugging, thrusting, wrenching, and kicking, I found the strenuous muscular exercise strangely exhilarating. Evidently there is something to be said for the simple life as lived in those primitive communities where every man is his own policeman. But this physically stimulating bout came to a sudden end. Our mazy revolutions brought us presently near the foot of the steps, and here Spotty tripped over the prostrate form of the third man. He staggered back a few paces and uttered a husky shriek, and then we came down together on top of the Jew. That finished him. The contact with these two motionless shapes shattered his nerves utterly and reduced him to sheer panic. He ceased to fight and only whimpered for mercy. It was very unpleasant. As long as the fight was hot and strenuous, the revived instincts of long forgotten primitive ancestors kept my blood racing. But with the first cry for mercy, all my exhilaration died out, and the degenerate emotions of civilized man began to make themselves felt. If I hesitated, I was lost. At every pitiful bleat I felt myself weakening. There was only one thing to do, and I did it, with the concussor. Verbal description is a slow affair compared with action. The whole set of events that I have narrated occupied but a few minutes. When I unbolted the parlour door and found a somnolent navvy waiting to be shaved, I realized with astonishment how brief the interlude had been. "Hope I haven't kept you waiting," I said, anxious to learn if he had heard anything unusual. "No," he replied. "I've only just come in. Didn't expect to find you open." He seated himself in the chair, and I lathered him profusely, with luxurious pleasure in handling the clean soapsuds. The folly of my late visitors in leaving the shop door unfastened surprised me and illustrated afresh the poverty of the criminal intelligence. They had assumed that it would all be over in a moment and had taken no precautions against the improbable. And such is the habitual with whom the costly machinery of the law is unable to cope. Verily, there must be a good many fools besides the dishonest ones. I shut up the shop when my customer departed, indulged in a good wash and a substantial supper, for there was much to be done before I could go to bed. I had providently laid in 6 casks of a suitable size, of which 2 were put together and the remainder in the form of loose staves and hoops. One of these would have to be made up at once, since it was necessary that the specimens should be packed before rigor mortis set in and rendered them unmanageable. Accordingly, I fell to work after supper with the mallet and the broad chisel-like tool with which the hoops are driven in, and did not pause until the bundle of staves was converted into a cask, complete save for the top hoop and head. I proceeded systematically. Into one cask I poured a quart of water, and wetted the interior thoroughly to make the wood swell and secure tight joints. Then into it I introduced the Jew in a sitting posture, and was gratified to find that the specimen occupied the space comfortably. But here a slight difficulty presented itself. The centre of gravity in a cask filled with homogeneous matter coincides with the geometrical centre. But in a cask containing a deceased Jew, the centre of gravity would be markedly eccentric. Such a cask would not roll evenly, and irregular rolling might lead to investigation. However, the remedy was quite simple. My predecessor had been accustomed to cover the floor of the shop with sawdust, and the peculiar habits of my customers had led me to continue the practice. An immense bin of the material occupied a corner of the cellar, and furnished the means of imparting a fictitious homogeneity to the contents of the cask. I shovelled in a quantity around the specimen, headed up the cask, and finished filling it through the bunghole. When I had driven in the bung, I gave the cask a trial roll on the cellar floor, and found that it moved without noticeable irregularity. It was past midnight before I had finished my labours and had the 3 casks ready for removal. After another good wash, I went to bed, and, thanks to the invigorating physical exercise, had an excellent night. The following day being Sunday, there was a regrettable delay, since it would have been unwise to challenge attention by trundling the casks through the street when all the world was resting. However, I called at my Bloomsbury house, instructed the sergeant-major that some packages might be delivered on the following day, and, I added, that I should probably be working in the laboratory tomorrow, so if you hear me moving about you will know that it is all right. The sergeant-major touched his cap (he always wore a cap indoors) without speaking. He was the most taciturn and incurious man that I have ever met. When I had taken a look round the laboratory and made a few preparations, I departed, going out by the museum entrance. It was as well to get the sergeant-major used to these casual, unannounced appearances and disappearances. I walked slowly back to Whitechapel, turning over my plans for the removal of the casks. At first I had thought of taking them to Pickford's receiving office, but there was danger in this, though it was a remote danger. If one of the casks should be accidentally dropped, it would most certainly burst, and then, I had no particular objection to being killed, but I had a very great objection to being sent to Broadmoor. So I decided to effect the removal myself, and with the aid of the builder's truck that I had allowed the owner to keep in my yard. But this plan involved the adoption of some sort of disguise. A very slight one would be sufficient, as it was merely to prevent recognition by casual strangers. Now, among the stock of my predecessor, Polensky, I had found a collection of powder colours, grease paint, toupee paste, spirit gum, and other materials which threw a curious light on his activities. On my return to the shop I made a few experiments with these materials, and was astonished to find on what trivial peculiarities facial expression depends. For instance, I discovered that a strip of court plaster, carried tightly up the middle of the forehead, where it would be hidden by a hat, altered the angle of the eyebrows and completely changed the expression, and that a thin scrumble of purple, rubbed on the nose, totally altered the character of the face. This was deeply interesting, and, as it finally disposed of one difficulty, it left me free to consider the rest of my plans, which I continued to do until every possible emergency was anticipated and provided for. Early on Monday morning I went out and purchased 4 lengths of stout quartering, 2 long and 2 short, a coil of rope, and 2 block of tackle of the kind known to mariners as Handy Billy, and a pair of cask grips. With the quartering and some lengths of rope I made 2 cask slides, one long for the cellar and a short one for the handcart. Placing the long side in position, I greased it with cart grease, hooked up the tackle above the upper end, attached the grips, and very soon had the 3 casks hoisted up into the passage that opened into the back yard. With the aid of the short slide and the tackle, I ran them up into the cart, lashed them firmly in position with the stout rope, threw in the slide and tackle, and was ready to start. Running into the shop, I fixed the necessary strip of court plaster on my forehead, tinted my nose, and, having pocketed the stick of paint and a piece of plaster, put on my shabbiest overcoat and neckcloth, trod on my hat and jammed it on my head so that it should cover the strip of plaster. Then I went out, trundling the cart into the alley, locked the back gate, and set forth on my journey. Navigating the crowded streets with the heavy cart clattering behind me, I made my way westward, avoiding the main thoroughfares with their bewildering traffic, until I found myself in Theobald's Row, at the end of Red Lion Street. Here I began to look about for a likely deputy, and presently my eye lighted on a sturdy-looking man who leaned somewhat dejectedly against the post and sucked at an empty pipe. He was evidently not a regular corner boy, I judged him to be a labourer out of work, and deciding that he would serve my purpose, I addressed him. "Want a job, mate?" He roused at once. "You've 'it it, mate, I do. What sort of job?" "Pull this truck round to 6A, Pimsbury Street, and deliver the tubs." "'Ow much'll you give me?" was the inevitable inquiry. "Old chap'll give you half a crown if you ask him." "And 'ow much am I to keep?" "Oh, we won't quarrel about that. I've got to see to another job or I'd take 'em myself. You deliver the tubs, and be careful of 'em. They're full of valuable chemicals. And meet me here at 10 o'clock and I'll give you another job. Will that do you?" My friend pocketed his pipe and spat on his hands. "Gimme the bloomin' truck," he said, and when I had surrendered the pole to him, he set off at a pace that made me thankful for the stout rope lashings of the casks. I let him draw ahead, and then followed at a discreet distance, keeping him in sight until he was within a few hundred yards of my house. Then I darted down a side turning, took a short cut across a square, and, arriving at the museum entrance, let myself in with my Yale key. To remove my hat, overcoat and coat, to tear off the plaster and wash my nose, was but the work of a minute. I had placed in readiness my laboratory apron, a velvet skull cap, and a pair of spectacles, and scarcely had I assumed these and settled my eyebrows into a studious frown when the bell rang. A glance into a little mirror that hung on the wall satisfied me as to the radical change in my appearance, and I went out confidently and opened the street door. My deputy was standing on this doorstep and touched his cap nervously as he met my portentous frown. "These here barrels for you, sir?" he asked. "Quite right," I replied in deep, pompous tones. "I will help you to bring them in." We brought the cart up on the pavement with the pole across the threshold, and I fixed the slide in position while my assistant cast off the lashings. In a couple of minutes we had run the casks down the slide, and I had the satisfaction of seeing them safely deposited in the hall. The dangers and difficulties of the passage were at an end. I handed my proxy the half-crown, which he sheepishly demanded, with an extra shilling for a glass of beer, and saw him go on his way rejoicing. Then I went back to the laboratory, stuck on a fresh strip of plaster, rubbed on a tint of grease paint, and resumed my disreputable garments. When I came forth into the street, the hand-cart had already disappeared, leaving me to pursue my way unobserved to the rendezvous, where I presently met my friend, and, having rejoiced with him a further shilling, resumed possession of the cart. On my arrival at my Whitechapel premises, I affixed a notice to the window informing the nobility and gentry that I was absent on business. Then I clothed myself decently, emptied the contents of the safe into a handbag, into which I also put the cooper's chisel, locked up the premises, and hurried off to Aldgate Station. My first objective was the establishment of Mr. Hammerstein, the dealer in osteology, from whom I purchased 3 articulated human skeletons, and obtained the invaluable receipted invoices, and having thus taken every precaution that prudence and human foresight could suggest, I repaired to my Bloomsbury house, let myself in at the museum door, rolled the casks through into the laboratory, and proceeded to unpack the specimens. The initial processes occupied me far into the night, while, as to the finishing operations, they kept me busy for over a month, during which time I shaved and cut hair throughout the day, up to 9 o'clock at night, reserving the laboratory work for a relaxation after the prosaic labours of the day. Looked at broadly, the episode was highly satisfactory and successful, excepting in one vital respect. None of the 3 specimens had ringed hair. The completed preparations were, after all, the by-products of my industry. The wretch whom I sought was still at large and unidentified. My collection still lacked its crowning ornament. Chapter 6